So this is a time of fear. If there is any single theme that I would name during this crisis, it is the human experience of fear. And this, of course, is unfortunate. There is a lot of trauma happening, and people are traumatizing themselves and each other in a number of ways. But at the same time, this fear is a motivating force. It's a way of bringing us together in action. And there are positive aspects of our reactions, including learning the value of friendship and community and how precious life truly is. This evening, I'd like to talk about this crisis in the context of other crises, and also talk about how to make use of the very encouraging events that the virus outbreak has precipitated for us. Because there is an inspiration that we can gain from this that can motivate us to make the world a better place. First and foremost is that we who have chosen to live together in community in the mountains of Vermont, are right now among the luckiest people in the world. We are safer from this outbreak than most everyone, and we're also closer to our friends, to those people who we can trust and depend on, than most everyone. This is a great gift to us, but it's also a gift that we've earned. It's a gift that we chose. And I suggest that it's a gift that more people should choose. It's worth setting up your life so that you live in a small community with people you can trust. Another thing we've learned is that it's very difficult to gain the skills needed to work through extreme emotions after those emotions have arisen. It's difficult to be the clear, sane person in a crowd of panic. And it's even more difficult to become capable of that after the crowd has started to panic. And so we can see how important it is that we gain the skills of wisdom and compassion day by day, so that we're increasingly capable of responding, so that we truly can function clearly right in the midst of panic, of frenzy. And also, this crisis and the response that we've had to it should give us enormous confidence in our ability to change the world. We have responded as a society, as a global society, and have been willing to shut down society as we know it, shut down our economy as we know it. And people have been saying for a long time that that's impossible. We can't respond to, for example, the climate crisis, because there's nothing you can do. You can't just shut down society. But now we've proven that you can shut down society. If people care enough about lives, then we can do it. And this care, this compassion that we are demonstrating now can be redirected to deal with the far greater crisis that climate has presented to us. and that other existential threats have presented. Because we know that as bad as this crisis is, it isn't nearly as bad as the existential threats such as the climate crisis continue to be. So this evening I want to talk very quickly about a lot of material. One part is the internal response. How should we work with this internally, or you could say personally? On a personal level, on an emotional level within ourselves. The next I want to talk about is how do we respond on a local level? What's the best way to respond on a local level? And then finally, globally. How should we respond globally? And to put it in a nutshell, the best way to respond internally, personally, is to become capable of being aware of the problem without going insane. Of course, it's very difficult. When we're insane, we often don't believe that we are insane. A lot of the time, exactly the people who are most confident that they are not insane are the ones who are most insane. So it's not so much about subjectively would we identify as insane. I've been speaking to a lot of people who feel that they're rational who are not over the past few weeks. And so again, regardless of the specific situation, we have to gain certain skills that allow us to be aware of the problem without getting so entangled in it that we go crazy. And in order to do that, we should respond with a spiritual practice. This is one of the great benefits of a spiritual practice. Locally, the appropriate response is to move. To totally change your life, uproot your entire life, and move into a small community of people who you can trust. Trusting people does not mean agreeing with them. And in fact, when we spend time agreeing too much, it's an indication that we are not a trustworthy community. It is oftentimes in the disagreements that we demonstrate our trustworthiness. And it's important to do this right away because, while this crisis is quite extreme, it won't last forever. It might last a year or something like that. But even during this crisis, this is not the moment to move. You want to have already moved into such a community, establish yourself, so that you can, as I say, be living ensconced in a wonderful place as you see the world fall apart. And then finally, globally, we should use this crisis to prove to ourselves that we can respond to large-scale crises, and that we recognize that there are much more serious problems. For example, the climate crisis, which looks like it will probably kill many more people than this virus. And we are capable of coming together and making a difference. So I'd like to start there. I'd like to talk about the global level first, and then move back into the local, and then the personal. And I'm going to work through something that I know is very emotional right now in a somewhat intellectual way by giving a bit of a history of pandemics, of these sorts of health problems on a global scale. Just a bit of a history, just to put this in context. Because it's important for us to understand this. So, there are two previous events that are, at this point anyway, most cited. One is something called the Spanish flu, and another is something called the Black Death. So, the Spanish flu was a major pandemic that came about right after World War I. And spread very quickly and very widely and resulted in the death of, just to make nice round numbers, roughly 100 million people worldwide. This was traumatic for the world. The First World War, which was the deadliest conflict in all of world history, was finally seeming to be coming to a close, although, as we know now, it was about to blow up again in what we call World War II soon enough. But in any case, it seemed that this horrible event of death and destruction was ending, and then a completely different problem, this pandemic, the Spanish flu, came forth and was very confusing. How to respond to it, where it was coming from, how to understand it. And we carry that trauma in our bodies, in our cultural history, and I'd suggest even to a certain extent in our genetic patterns. If you go back even further, then you come to the Bubonic Plague, generally called the Black Death, and that also killed roughly, more or less, the same number of people, about 100 million, which was a much larger percentage of the population, and was something like a quarter, maybe even a third, of the population of Europe, and completely revolutionized European civilization, was very important in world history, and came soon before colonialism, which meant that that event, the impact of that on the European psyche was soon enough, the trauma of that was soon enough carried worldwide. The important thing to understand is that both of these events are carried in us now. We went through that. We were traumatized by this. The kind of fear and panic that we're seeing now happened at those times. And during it, at least the Black Death happened at a far greater scale. In many places, it killed 80 to 90% of the population. And, as I say, revolutionized society. Just to give one example, the class system that was so prominent at the time in Europe was permanently, we'll say damaged, maybe even you might say broken, by that event, because the aristocracy was weakened, and the number of workers was decreased so much that those who remained had a lot of power and could make far higher wages. And so we ended up with, just a little while later, a few centuries later, with the Renaissance, and then you have the French Revolution, in which equality is taken to be a central tenet of society. Now, there are many different events in history that resulted in that, but the Black Death was major. And so we see how this kind of thing can change our society and cause us to look for meaning in new places, cause us to see that perhaps the whole world needs to be structured differently. One of the major points that people asked, especially during the Black Death, was, what is God trying to tell us? This is a very religious society, and people couldn't understand the message that God was trying to give with this disease. Nowadays, we may look at it differently. We may not see God's message as the core of everything that happens, but at the time, that was the normal way of looking at things. And people weren't able to accept that perhaps God's message, however you want to define God, was travel less, trade less, and breed less. In other words, human growth is not the goal of the universe. The world wasn't made for human growth, for the growth of things that people like. On the contrary, perhaps enough is enough. Well, we didn't want that message, and we weren't willing to accept it, and for that reason, it was a major blow for the church in Europe. Not that they weren't able to give that reason, and people weren't able to understand it. I hope perhaps that we're able to understand it now, that this virus may have a message for us, namely, stop, slow down, stop thinking that growth, that the growth of things people like is the goal of the world. On the contrary, completely change direction. The direction of your entire civilization has to change now. If we finally got that message now, that would be good. Several hundred years late, arguably thousands of years late. But in any case, that is the message that human beings need to hear. In any case, we have been traumatized by this before. And that is the reason that we're willing and able to panic about it now. We're able to be motivated in this way because we have this in our history. We have experienced this before. Again and again, every few hundred years, there is another outbreak like this. It's not a new thing. Because it's not a new thing, we can understand two things about it. One is, it hurts. It really hurts to see people die in this way. That's very painful. It's frightening to think that we might die in that way, our loved ones might die in this way. So this trauma, this emotional pain, is in us. And we have to work with that. But there is another message, and that is that we've survived it again and again. This is a major threat, but we're going to survive it. This isn't going to be the end of civilization. On the other side, an issue like the threat of nuclear weapons, the threat of climate change, we have not experienced those before. We have not dealt with those things before. And so we aren't as good at being afraid of them. We don't have that trauma stored up in our bodies, stored up in our cultures. And so they seem foreign and distant and abstract. I think to most people it seems very natural that this virus seems tangible and scary, but climate change seems distant and abstract. But I'd suggest that the main reason for that is that we have been through this before, but we've never been through the climate crisis before. And for that reason, it's hard for us to conceptualize it intellectually, and it's hard for us to grasp it emotionally. But what's difficult for us to see is that it is precisely because we've been through this before that we are both more able to be worried about it, and that it is proven that this isn't of existential danger. Because we've been through it before. We survived it. And yet, in surviving it, we stored up the fear of it. It is therefore of the utmost importance that we redirect our response to deal with something that requires much more maturity. The maturity to see the true threats to our civilization and, in fact, to the world. Because this threat is worrisome. It is. But it isn't likely that it's going to kill even as many people as the Black Death, or the Spanish flu. Maybe worst case scenario, it also kills 100 million people. It's very unlikely. Climate change, terminal nuclear war. This will kill, well, maybe everyone. If there's runaway climate change, civilization collapses, there's a good chance that right around 8 billion people die. And yet, we're far more concerned about the coronavirus crisis than the climate crisis. We're willing to shut down civilization for the one, but not the other. And it's very important for us to mature and to be confident, to see that if we care, if we really don't want people to die, then we're willing to make a major change. But it requires maturity, partially because in this case, people who are generally more powerful are impacted less. So as we've seen, the poor people who are laid off right now, their lives are completely destroyed. The wealthy people, of course, they lose a little bit of money, but relatively speaking, they're taking a vacation. If we look at society, at civilization, what is it that indicates that a person will have power? Well, one of the major things is something that most of us don't consider, that being age. It's very common that older people have more power than younger people. It's actually a better predictor than race or gender. As we become older, we tend to have more power. And that is just. There's nothing wrong with that. We get wiser. We have closer social connections and such. But this is a crisis. The virus impacts older people more than younger people. They have more power, and so there's a greater concern. The climate crisis impacts younger people more than older people. And so the older people may be dead by the time it has its largest impact. Beyond that, the people in the climate crisis who are hurt at this time, who have been hurt by it already, are these relatively poor people quite far away from the powerful people in, say, the United States, in India, or someplace like that. In India, who knows where that is? For a lot of us, it seems like it's on another planet, because we don't have the ability to connect on that global scale. And so it's either, the climate crisis is either threatening people far away, at least far away from the most powerful people, far away now, or threatening everyone, but at some time in the future. And it's very hard for people. It's a limitation that we have because for human beings, empathy decreases with distance. As people are further away in space or in time, it becomes harder and harder for us to be compassionate. Our compassion reaches them less and less. And this is a major limitation for us. So, of course, the climate crisis requires more maturity, but again, our response to this crisis is a wonderful, you could say, practice for the kind of response that's needed for other major existential crises. And what's very encouraging is that we have a spiritual practice. Spiritual practices exist that allow us to overcome that tendency, so that more and more we have compassion that extends through space and time, further and further, including more and more people. And then beyond that, this virus, even if it were to kill all the human beings, which, as I say, is not discussed as a possibility, even so, that would just be one species. But the climate crisis The nuclear threat impacts the entire world, all species, in one way or another. And is dangerous to far more living things, orders of magnitude more. And a spiritual practice allows us to identify with, be compassionate towards more and more living things. So this crisis is a wonderful opportunity for us to see how good we are when we can see the impact. So here we can see, I can do this clear thing, self-isolate, for example, and that way it's less likely that I will get it, less likely those people I'm near will get it, and that's something that you can see in a very short time frame, days, weeks, months. Beyond that, it's relatively easy because it more or less accords the most extreme pain accrues to those who are least powerful. The least pain is those who are most powerful, which is different for the climate crisis. With that, we have to mature in order to see we can come together just as we have around this one and feel very encouraged by that. We do that by identifying, by having compassionate feelings towards, identifying with more and more beings, further and further away in space and time, and understanding cause and effect, understanding how things occur causally at deeper and deeper levels, until we get to the point where we can have this same kind of willingness to drastically change how we live, to drastically change the way society functions, in order to solve that very serious threat. So we can see this, we see that we can achieve this level of change very quickly, and then there are just a few things we have to change and mature in order to have this same level of impact, but in a way that will save the world, will literally save the world. Bring us to a completely new and far superior future. So this is our response at a global scale. If we consider locally, how do we work with this locally? Well, this accords very nicely with the global solution. So if we now go back even one further step, so we went back to the Spanish flu about 100 years ago, back to the Black Death, which is 600 years ago. Let's go back much further. Let's go back, we could just go back a little ways in terms of space, but let's just go back to 10,000 years ago in time, when this kind of pandemic was completely unknown. It never happened. And why did it never happen? It happened because people were living in small local communities. And if you live in a small local community with very little travel and trade, this kind of virus cannot spread. Infectious disease, as we know it today, didn't exist at all for the vast majority of of what we call of our human quote history, even though a lot of that is prehistorical. The time that human beings have been alive. Now, if we all lived in small local communities of people we trust, and it were possible, especially if those communities were somewhat self-sufficient, then we could shut down society in a similar way to what we've just done, but far more easily, and with far less emotional and psychological damage. I'm very worried about what this is doing to many people. For many people, this self-isolation is itself traumatizing, terribly traumatizing. We already live in a society that is one of the most anxious, depressed, and lonely of all of human history. And to add to that is horrifying. But if we live in these small local communities, that even if you shut down movement in the way that we have, well, good news. You're just in the same situation that those of us in monastic settings are already in. You're still around this small group of people who you know and love, and generally, at least to a certain extent, dislike, which is wonderful. Nothing wrong with disliking the people you love. That's actually one of the best parts of it. So we're together, and you disagree about this, and you squabble about that, but you still trust each other, you love each other, you're connected to each other, you believe in each other, you can count on each other. You depend on each other in the most important ways, and you don't have to leave. And if you don't leave, that's fine. You're not lonely. You're connected. And so you have a situation like the one that we're living in which you can stay in this small place, and you're happy. You're not alone. You can discuss major questions and disagree without losing trust. A lot of the time when people try to enter a local community and try to figure out who they want to live with, their basic way of deciding that is, do we agree about things? But agreeing is not a helpful way of determining if you can trust people. On the contrary, it's far more helpful to connect with people around things that are more basic, more fundamental than agreeing about views. Beyond this, we can create little societies in which we connect around sustenance, around being self-sufficient. But it's possible to have ways of growing food and even making other products so that when it's necessary to close things down, we can still take care of ourselves to a large extent. We're willing to shut down society, cause a global recession and probably depression in order to work with the number of deaths that this pandemic is possibly threatening us with. Why not be willing to change our society, to completely shift the direction of our society so that we can be happy? Not just so that we can avoid problems, but so that we can actually create solutions. The happiness of being connected and close and caring. Beyond this, it's very important to understand that it isn't necessary to do this completely. Every step in this direction is good. It isn't necessary that you have a situation in which everyone only lives in these small communities like we were 10,000 years ago. To whatever extent you can move in that direction, it's a good thing. And I want to be very clear that we should move into those communities now. Don't wait. We don't know when the next societal shutdown or collapse will happen. But once it happens, it is definitely too late to make that major shift in even your own life. Definitely too late to do it on a societal scale, but it's also too late to do it even on a personal scale. It has to have already been achieved. We have to already shifted our direction, put ourselves into a situation in which we can care for each other, be connected at that level. And so there's a sense of urgency to it, which is actionable right now. And if there's anything I've seen on the personal scale in this crisis, it's that what people are most afraid of is not having control. What's hardest for people is a sense of lack of control. Of course, the extreme thing is that we don't have control over whether we're going to die. That frightens us enormously. We want control over that. There are a lot of people who wish we wouldn't die at all. That to me is far more frightening than death. Can't imagine a more horrific world than one in which human beings didn't die. I think a world, what we want most, of course, is a world in which everyone dies, because death is a natural part of life. It's very important that everyone dies and no one kills. That's paradise. A world in which everyone dies and no one kills. Of course, to die you have to live, and so we want everyone to live and die. And we want no one to kill or be killed. But this is very subtle. This is very hard for us. It's very difficult for us to get to the point when we can see this subtlety in terms of virtue and ethics, compassion, and dealing with the great matter of life and death. And what is the best way to work with that? What's the best way to gain this clarity in which we can work with these very subtle and profound topics? Well, it's by living in a community of spiritual people who are moving through exercises that allow them to become more trustworthy. Part of this trustworthiness, as I said, part of a spiritual practice, as I said, is coming to have compassion for people who are further away in space and in time. That means including more and more people in our sphere of compassion. But another part of it is being willing to wrestle together with these major ethical questions. How do we do that? How do we consider these issues? And in particular, how do we have these conversations when we disagree? Because to have these conversations with people we agree with, well, that's not going to go very far. That's just a way of reifying our fixed views. The real challenge is to have our fixed views dismantled by real disagreements about precisely the things that we're most confident in, so that those are the things that we can let go of. So this is our local response. As soon as possible, completely change your life and move into a small community of people who are trustworthy, which is to say, becoming increasingly trustworthy, which is to say, making use of spiritual exercises in order to work together to clarify ethical issues, and who are, to a certain extent, self-sufficient. Which brings us finally back to the question of the inner, the meditative, the contemplative response to this crisis. And that response, once again, is how can we be aware of this problem without allowing it to drive us insane? And so I want to make a certain point clear, which might be somewhat, how shall we say, controversial. If you don't experience it as controversial, then you probably just haven't heard me say it. So I'll say it very clearly. That is, most of the people who I speak to right now in the world are completely insane. They're panicked, they're frenetic, they are irrational, and they are not making sense. They believe themselves to be completely sane. Or let me change the pronouns here to make it a little bit more clear why this should feel controversial. In all likelihood, you are insane. And it's okay that you know that I think you're insane. I've been talking to a lot of people recently, on the phone, over email and such, and almost all of them, far higher than 90%, I consider to be completely insane right now. People have lost their minds. Now, you can say good news. Sometimes people have to lose their minds in order to be motivated to take action. Okay, fine. So, good job. You lost your mind and now you're motivated to take action. Well done. However, it is somewhat traumatic and it isn't ideal. It may be better than nothing, but it's not ideal. 20 years ago, when the last kind of societal crisis occurred, I was in Japan. I was in a monastery in Japan. And on September 11th, there was a major terrorist attack, at least major by U.S. standards. For us, it felt major anyway. And I watched, and the other monks watched, society, even in Japan, but I have the sense that it was far more extreme here, watched everyone go insane and traumatize and re-traumatize themselves. Watching TV, watching the same images again and again, causing themselves as much emotional pain as possible, to a large extent, I think, just to feel the hit of it, because most people's lives nowadays are so boring. I know it seems strange, but I think a major reason we're so anxious nowadays is that we're so bored. Life seems stressful. We have so much to do, but none of it's actually that compelling. And so we're bored, and so we have to make drama to make up for the boredom, and that becomes anxiety. But also because there's a sense that that I'm doing something. It's as if I finally have some kind of control. What can I do? Well, nothing. Well, I know. I'll watch TV. I'll look at something on the internet and freak myself out again, and then I'll feel like I'm doing something. And so one of the most important things to do personally is do not look up anything on the coronavirus. If you're going to, then commit to not looking up anything, that the maximum number of times you will look at any media on the coronavirus is once a day, and that once a day should not last longer than 30 minutes. So make that commitment to yourself. You will not look up anything or read anything or watch anything about the coronavirus more than once a day, and that shouldn't last for more than 30 minutes. I was speaking to someone named Joshin, who runs our California facility, which is actually a wonderful place. They're doing great work there. They're going on shopping trips for the entire neighborhood. All the elderly people are being served by them, which again is why it's so important that we have these local communities. Because there they are. And I've seen emails from their whole neighborhood saying, this place is fantastic. I love this community. Because they say, I just read one recently, I'm 77, I can't go out of my house, and you guys are just bringing me food. It's unbelievable. It's such a gift to the world to have places like that. So I was talking to him, and he's very impressive. He's one of the few people in my life who I can talk to about this kind of thing, because he's one of the only people I know who's able to get involved in all the information without going insane. Almost everyone I know, the more information they get, the more insane they get. And so they have a choice between being uninformed and sane, or informed and insane. Either ignorant and sane, or knowledgeable and crazy. And neither group is a good group. But he's one of these very few people who's able to understand the information without losing his mind. And his assessment of our society now is that people know so much that they don't know anything. So consider the possibility that more information is not going to help you to assess the situation. Do not know more. That isn't going to help, especially given that the vast majority of the information out there is designed just to get you to panic so that you'll click on the next thing, and if you do it, then you're a pawn of the system. Their goal is not to help you understand. On the contrary, the less you understand and the more you panic, the better. The system is not designed to help you to assess it. So, commit. I will not inform myself about this, at least through those outlets, more than once a day, and that one time cannot be for more than half an hour. So very good. So then there you are in this situation, as I was in Japan. I learned plenty about the situation, but I didn't go insane. And I watched the United States lose its mind, and its response to 9/11 was far more damaging than 9/11. What we did in response to it caused far more suffering and death and injustice and horror and terror than all of the things that happened on September 11th. And yet we felt completely justified in it. And sadly, this fits right into what is so common for human beings, namely, that our solutions to problems very often cause larger problems. We often do solve problems, but our solutions cause even larger problems. And 20 years ago was an example of that. I'm concerned that in some way that may happen again now. And so we have to put ourselves in a position where we can be informed without going crazy. We have to be aware of the problem without losing our minds. And we have the opportunity as spiritual practitioners, people with a spiritual practice, to use specific exercises in order to become more capable of being present with the problem without getting entangled in it. These exercises should enable us to become capable at all three levels. The global level, including more and more people further away in space and time in our sphere of compassion. And in fact, more and more species until all living things throughout space and time are included in our sphere of compassion. That's one of the things that a spiritual practice should do. Another is it makes us more capable of working with people at a local level so that we can become more trustworthy by learning what it is to be trustworthy beyond agreement, beyond merely seeing things the same way. And then finally, in terms of the personal, which is what we'll have a chance to explore now in the meditation, it should allow us to cut through thinking. It should allow us to stay with our body sensations without thinking. One of the reasons that we're going crazy now is that we finally have to sit alone and face how we feel. Those feelings have been there for years. But we want an explanation for why we feel so bad, for why we feel so afraid. And it's easy. We can point at the virus and the way people are doing things. How are those other people behaving? That's why I feel so bad. But what we realize in this practice is that that isn't the main reason we feel so bad. We feel so bad because we've had those emotions for a long, long time. And we've been avoiding them by being busy. We've been so busy we couldn't face how we feel. And that in fact, that was a major reason that we made ourselves so busy. I was just contacted by someone today who said, I'm really trying to deal with this self-isolation thing. But I want to talk to you because I feel like you've done self-isolation a lot. You spent a long time in solitary retreat. You probably know a lot more about this than I do. And I'm not handling it that well. And to be clear, this person who said I'm not handling that well, this is one of the 2 or 3 people who I've spoken to recently who I consider sane. Almost everyone I've spoken to recently is insane. This one is aware that he's having a really hard time dealing with his self-isolation situation. That's a major reason he's sane. The people who think that they're doing fine with it, I'm going to put them into the insane category, because I talk to them and they're not sane. They're freaking out. They're spending hours a day learning about this, learning nothing, and filled with anger and distrust and fear, including of their own death, which is very confused and tangled. So we realize that it's possible to gain the skill of staying with body sensations without the mind explaining them away. As we often say, when the body feels something, the mind searches for an explanation for it. So your body feels something and the mind tries to figure out why, tries to justify the feelings through thoughts. And in general, those thoughts are about things that are happening outside of ourselves. Well, I feel this way because the way you are. And so most of us come to the basic life strategy of saying, if you would change, then I would be happy. If you would change, then I would be happy. Or if something or other would change. If I didn't die, then I would be happy. If you thought differently about me, then I would be happy. If the world was set up differently, then I would be happy. And as I often say, people have made that deal with me on a number of occasions. They've said, if you change, I'll be happy. And I said, really? Well, that sounds like a pretty good deal. And then I did my part. I changed. But they didn't do their part. They're not happy. And so we eventually see, whether it's in ourselves or in someone else, that it's not true. It is not the case that if something outside of me changes, I'll be happy. The shift that occurs is happily one that is right in our sphere of power. We can empower ourselves to do the spiritual exercises needed in order to break through the patterns that cause us such suffering. And at this point, I want to give people the most simple and most effective method, which I know is a very challenging method. But here we are. It's a crisis. So I'm going to give you a challenging method that's extremely effective. And it goes like this. Sit still and feel what you feel without thinking. Do not think about it, and do not think about anything else. Completely set aside storytelling, explanations, descriptions, and stay with body sensations. How do you feel right now? And that's it. Completely lose track of a story about yourself, a story about society, a story about the people who you care about or dislike. And instead of that, stay with whatever body sensations arise. This is the basic method. And it's one that will enable us to succeed personally right now in retaining our sanity, even while coming to understand the world that we live in. One that will allow us to connect with people locally and change our entire lives in order to connect with people at a deeper level of increasing trust. And one that will allow us to maintain such great compassion that we're able to accurately respond to the enormous threats, the enormous crises that face us in the world today. So, thank you so much for being a part of this, for being willing to deal with fear, being willing to face it. You are truly the heroes of this time. Those who are willing to face this are truly the heroes of this time. Let us make use of this opportunity to practice meditation and become more and more capable of saving the world.